All right. Good evening, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all joining us. And we'd like to thank, firstly, Rabbi Ken Spiro for joining us all the way from Israel. Rabbi Spiro is a senior lecturer and researcher at Aish Torah in Jerusalem and licensed tour guide from the Israeli Ministry of Tourism. He's given a number of series and projects all over the world. He's written a number of programs and a number of books. And it's an absolute pleasure for him to be speaking to us this evening on Destiny, how such a small nation can make such a small impact. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Without further ado, hand over to Rabbi Spiro.
Hi. Hi, everyone, or say good day or good evening. It's only morning here. I'm speaking to you from the old city of Jerusalem, where normally it would be a bustling place, but due to Mr. Virus, it's now as quiet as I've ever seen it, which I guess is good for our broadcast because we won't have a lot of noise in the background. Anyway, I was asked to present the topic, which I think is a good topic to focus on, A, during Passover, and B, during the coronavirus worldwide lockdown. And maybe it'll give us some perspective as to what our role is in this. And the presentation is called Destiny. I have a few images. This isn't really a PowerPoint. I actually have a massive PowerPoint that I'm not going to show you now, but just a few images to help us focus a little on the topic. It's actually the last book I wrote. Here it is. My mother makes me do all the advertisements as I speak. Is exactly on the topic, and I highly recommend it. It's actually sort of my greatest hits album. I know I've been to Australia a bunch of times speaking, and so maybe some of you have heard me speak at various locations, but I sort of put everything together in this book because I wear two hats. I wear the rabbi hat and I wear the historian hat. And unfortunately, Jewish history tends to be the big black hole of most Jews, even very well-educated Jews, really don't know their history. And our history is so amazing. And as we talk about in this presentation, we might be a small, teeny tiny people, but we have played a huge role in human history. And the goal of what we're going to try and talk about now is why is that so? Why does such a tiny nation play such a big role in human history? One of the things I always liked was I love epic movies like this Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. You know, these are the things that I really like. And I noticed having seen many of them, some of them multiple times, especially Lord of the Rings, my all-time favorite extended version. I've noticed that all of these stories, sometimes they take place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Sometimes they take place in the modern world. Sometimes on a different planet in the future, who knows? But if you pick any of these stories and start to run them through your mind, you'll notice they have a tremendous commonality of plot. It's called the story beats. Number one, and this is really the plot of all these Hollywood epics. Number one, it's a cosmic struggle of good and evil. The world always is in some sort of ideals phase, and then it goes into there's a dark force comes in, and the world goes into what's a fall, into darkness. Okay? So what's at stake is the whole fate of the world. There's a little superhero. Sometimes it's Luke Skywalker, it's Harry Potter, it's Neo in The Matrix, you name it. It's Frodo in Lord of the Rings. But he's always facing a huge big bad guy. The hero doesn't even want the task. Okay, but the problem is he can't escape his destiny. He's not looking for the glory. He's not looking for the honor. I always think of that scene in Star Wars, the original Star Wars. I'm so glad they keep coming out with more prequels. I remember the first movie that came out in 1977. I remember when Luke Skywalker is standing there in the double sun setting on Dantooine, and he's basically contemplating his fate. Is he going to embrace his destiny, or is he going to just run off and hide or just stay a farmer, that kind of thing? The odds are totally stacked against a little superhero. You know, whether it's Frodo versus Saruman, it's completely outgunned. Oops, sorry about that. Let's see if we can get rid of that. There we go. He has a series of encounters with the bad guy, which he should have lost all of them. Sometimes he barely survives them. The hero has strengths he doesn't even know he has sometimes. They come out. There's a lot more. I remember another scene in Lord of the Rings where it's, I think in the first movie maybe, where Gimli says about Frodo, there's more to this little hobbit than meets the eye. There's a lot more to the Jewish people than meet the eye. There's a final cataclysmic kind of showdown between the big bad guy and the little superhero. Of course, the good triumphs and evil is destroyed. And of course, movie's over, we go home happily ever after. So the reason I hold that the reason that all these movies share this plot is, first of all, that it's sort of built into our brains that this is the way this story is supposed to play out. But the cooler part that I noticed as a historian and a rabbi, when I put it together, looking at these movies and as a almost an obsessive student of Jewish history, I've noticed that you can literally run through these story beats, and that every single one of these story beats holds true for Jewish history. You know, we run off to these movies because we want to escape our mundane reality. But the reality is the Jewish people collectively are the little superhero in the ultimate story, and we don't have to run off to the movies. We're actually living it. The big difference is unlike in these movies where it's maybe one hero over the course of a few years, it's multiple generations of Jews serving as one collective protagonist in what is a story that spans over thousands of years. So what we're going to do is, based on our story beats that I laid out over here, we're going to run through Jewish history. And again, I don't have a whole PowerPoint here. You're going to be looking at just a couple images the whole time. And we're going to be able to check off every single one of these. And we're going to see that it's not fantasy. This isn't escapism. It's not Hollywood. This is reality. It's part of the Jewish people. It's part of our collective destiny as a people. It's extremely relevant to each and every one of us, that we are all like cells in one giant body, a part of this little superhero incredible mission, which is actually someone. Make sure you're muting your. If you're joining, make sure you're hitting your mute on the microphone. And not only are we part of the story, and it's very real, but we're actually very close to the end of the story, and we're getting pushed closer every single minute. So it's a very powerful thing to do, I think, especially during Chol HaMoed Pesach, especially at these very interesting times we're in. I say interesting, there's an old Chinese curse. It says, may you live in interesting times. And we're definitely living in interesting times. So let's first of all go back to the beginning and work our way through. So first we have to appreciate that there's a plot to this story. And before we talk about a cosmic struggle of good and evil, before we get to the struggle, we have to talk about, in every one of these movies, there was an ideal state that is lost and the world goes into darkness and a decline. So if we rewind in Jewish history, we see that we start keeping time in Judaism from what event? The answer is day 6 of creation, which is the creation of human beings. And right now what I'm doing, I'm laying out the plot, the way the world was before it went into that decline. Okay, so day 6 is the creation of human beings. The fact that we start keeping time from day 6 is a big lesson there. Just as we're speaking about movie analogies, just as in a movie, the director's camera is focusing on the actors, so too, we're learning here that by the fact that we start keeping time from day 6 and not day 1, not from the Big Bang, but from when human beings are created and God puts the soul in us, that the focus of creation is human beings. The camera is on us, so to speak. Okay, but what's the plot of the story? And the answer to that is Judaism teaches that the purpose of creation is pleasure. We could do a whole class. We do a class. I'm an Esha Torah guy. Rabbi Noach Weinberg of blessed memory does a wonderful class based on the teachings of the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto from the 18th century in his book Masilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just. But to summarize the book in a minute, the class in a minute, he said the purpose of creation is pleasure. There are different levels of pleasure. Not all pleasures are the same, but it's a fundamental philosophical belief in Judaism that the highest level of pleasure, excuse me, I should probably wear my mask when I'm speaking, lest I get past the virus on via our internet call. But that the purpose of creation is pleasure, and the highest level of pleasure is relationship with God. That's what it's all about. That's what the Garden of Eden was about. So God creates us, programs our soul to want a relationship with him, puts us in a perfect environment, which is the Garden of Eden, which is not some like Club Med vacation place, but it's an ideal physical, spiritual state when we have no distractions, nothing to deal with, sort of like the way we are in now. And we're supposed to focus all of our time and all of our attention on building relationship with God. And therefore, and it should have been that basically we hang out in the garden, building relationship with God, living happily ever after. The Bible should have been like one Torah portion long, happily ever after. That's exactly the thing we have in the Hollywood movies. Initially, the world was in an ideal state. Things were good, things were peaceful, things were quiet, but then a darkness fell. So this is the forerunner. This is the very beginning of pre-Jewish history. This is the plot laid out in the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible. But then what happens is, I mean, think about it. we have this confusion about pleasure. We think that the opposite of pain is pleasure. It's actually not true. Pain and pleasure go together, like we say in sports. No pain, no gain. So the higher the level of pleasure, the more work it requires. So what Jewish tradition teaches us is people just found it too hard to maintain that relationship with God. He's an invisible, infinite being. He's not standing in front of you like I am in front of your computer screen. And the early narrative of the Bible, beginning with the second Torah portion, is the floods, is basically going to the Noah's Ark flood story, where relationship with God is lost. The purpose of creation is lost. And humanity loses its way, both spiritually and morally. It basically gets diverted into idolatry. And as we see in the first book I wrote, I'll do a bunch of infomercials as we go. First book I wrote, World Perfect, which is the first presentation I did. I remember going to Australia like 25 years ago, schlepping a 15-pound projector from place to place doing this presentation. But this book deals with exactly that point, the relationship between our relationship as human beings with God and our relationship with each other. So the world declines. The relationship with God is lost. The darkness sets in like it does in the Hollywood epic. But there's also a moral decline. The world degenerates into lawlessness and violence. Ironically and interestingly, the word used in the second Torah portion is the world degenerates into Hamas. I always say, I wonder if that terrorist organization in Gaza knew that when they picked the name for their organization, Hamas, lawlessness and violence. So the whole plot is lost. In the middle, God decides to try and get humanity back on target by sparing one man and his family, Noah, hoping that they will repopulate the world with people who have a relationship with him. Is Noah successful? No. He's righteous enough to save himself, but not proactive enough to save the world. That's a great lesson for us, by the way, about the importance of not just being a tzaddik, so to speak, and holy in ourselves, but being proactive towards our fellow human beings and certainly towards our family and the Jewish people. So the world continues to decline until it bottoms out at the Tower of Babel story. Okay, and that's what we see. This is where we basically see the darkness hits the bottom. And the Tower of Babel story is the story of humanity uniting, but for all the wrong reasons. What do we call that today? General Assembly of the United Nations. A good organization in theory, but hasn't worked out so well in practice. We'll talk about them a little later. Back then, they unite to rebel against God. Today, they basically unite to condemn Israel. But imagine God thinking, that's it, I've had it. I tried with Adam, he blew it. I tried with Noah, he blew it. Tower of Babel, they blew it. Forget it. Maybe we'll just nuke the universe. Forget the Big Bang. We'll do the Big Crunch. We'll collapse the universe back. We'll try again, and maybe next time human beings will get it right. But now we see, just when everything seems doomed, just when the fate of the world is at stake, like it's all like teetering on the edge of disappearing into darkness, along comes our little superhero. And you can see we're running down our list. You could just check every one of these off. And this person, I hold this individual, this biblical character, is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest intellectual and idealist of all time. And that's Abraham. And Abraham is great for two reasons. In a world that has totally lost connection with God, fumbled the ball, so to speak, lost the plot, Abraham is a radically transformative, free-thinking super genius. He's able to think outside the box and reconnect to a completely counterintuitive, infinite, invisible being. I always say, imagine being the only person in the world to believe in a radically transformative, incomprehensible idea that most people would kill you for even saying. How many of us would have the chutzpah to even whisper to their best friends? And that's the real greatness of Abraham. This is his real strength. That he says, not only is he radically transformative, but he says, I don't care what people think. I want truth regardless of consequences. I will choose to live if necessary to die for the reality of God. Now, don't get me wrong. Abraham knows much better than we know. You don't live for God. You don't die for God. You don't do anything for God. He's infinite. You don't do anything for infinity. He can only give to us, and we can just take. But Abraham recognizes that without relationship with God, we're doomed. We're missing the whole point of reality. We're going to destroy ourselves on every level, spiritually, morally. So Abraham will dedicate himself to a unique mission. And this is his other great trait, that he decides, he makes the commitment. He could have repeated Noah's era and just said, I'm saving myself. But he says, no, I am going to proactively embark on a mission to restore sanity to the world. So does he want the task? It's not clear he wants it, but he recognizes there's, like we say, in the place where there's no one else, you got to be the man. He recognizes there is no one else. The fate of the world is basically resting on his shoulders. And he dedicates himself to a unique mission, which is the chosen people thing, which almost everyone is aware of this concept. Jews are the chosen people, but very few people can articulate it. And it's very important that all of you watching be able to explain this to someone, because one day someone's going to walk up to you and go, you think you're chosen? You Jews? What are you going to answer? And the way I explain it simply is Abraham says to God, God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life and the life of my descendants to one mission, to teaching the world about the reality of you and the values that come from relationship with you. And God says back to Abraham, Abraham, you're choosing me, then I choose you and your descendants, us, the Jewish people. What are we chosen for? We're not chosen for privilege. It may be a privilege to be Jewish, but we're not chosen for privilege. We're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility? The word we love to use in the Jewish word, I think overused and often misused, is tikkun olam, fix the world. How's that for a cause? A little bigger than save the whales? Okay, but the real job of the Jewish people is Kiddush Hashem. It's to live and act in a way that inspires other people, to be the God squad. People are supposed to look at us as individuals and a nation and say, look at those Jewish people. Look at how they live. Look at their attitude towards life. Look at their marriages. Look at their families. Look at how they run their businesses, their community. What's their secret? Our job is to get the world back on target. It's the ultimate mission. And if we don't do it, it doesn't get done. Like we see as we check down our list over here, the hero, he doesn't necessarily want the job, but we can't escape our destiny. Our role in human history is far too central. And of course, the odds are totally stacked against us. So we understand now we have a plot rewrite. The original plot, the ideal state the world was in before the fall, before the darkness hit, was humanity hangs out in the garden, building relationship with God, but they drop the ball and Abraham picks it up and decides to run with it. I'll use a football analogy since I know you guys got Aussie rules football. You know what I'm talking about. So the new plot is humanity returns to God. Jewish people lead the way. And it's important to understand that we introduced something else. Barbara Tuchman, who's one of my favorite historians, passed away many years ago. She mentions in a book, I think it's Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, in his book Zachor, which means remember, he says that Herodotus the Greek is the father of history. He's the first historian in the Western world going back 2,500 years ago. But he says we Jews are the fathers of meaning in history. We are the first people to realize that history is a controlled process leading to a destination. We're not randomly, in the ancient world, up until even Sir Isaac Newton in the 17th century believed that time had no beginning or end. We believe we're in a story with a beginning, with an end. There's a director, there's a plot. This is exactly like the Hollywood analogy. History is a controlled process leading to a destination. It's called determinism. I wanted to read you a quote from a famous historian named Norman F. Cantor. He's actually one of the world's experts on medieval history, but he writes, in the Hebrew view, God exists before the world began. But he created it. But he acts in our lives through history. God sets up a drama in which men participate. He directs the course of human history, and he does all of this to give man a chance to love him. In the drama of history, which has a definable beginning and moves towards a definable end, man has the freedom to love God or to reject him. So he lays out the mission. He doesn't so much talk about, Jewish people's role in the story, but it's amazing how he uses all of this movie stuff. It's directed, beginning, end, plot. And just to read a quote from Yerushalmi, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. By the way, both of these historians are Jews. I know Norman Cantor is not a religious Jew. I don't believe Yerushalmi is either, but in his book Zachor, he writes, for the rabbis, the Bible is not only a repository of past history, but a revealed pattern for the whole history. And they learned their scripture well. They knew that history has a purpose, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, and that the Jewish people had a central role to play in the process. Perfect for my analogy. This is a movie, there's a plot. We have a role to play in it. The big difference, however, is unlike in a movie, the actors might seem to be expressing real emotions and making real decisions, but they're really just reading their lines and trying to effectively impart, an emotional reality to the lines they're giving over. We have the ability to interact with the creator and with our free will, and sort of define how things go in the story, quickly, slowly, painfully, painlessly. So now we've laid out and we've actually checked off most of the first few items in our Hollywood story beats and see that they actually pertain to Jewish history. Now the question is, okay, Rabbi, you're making this point. How can we see this as a reality? And as we go through Jewish history, we can again continue to see that we can check off every one of these story beats. So because we choose for ourselves a unique role in the story, just as in a movie, the camera is going to focus. We're the lead actors, and the people who get the most camera time in any movie are the lead actors. We see that we get the lead actor. We become the lead actors in the story. If you look at if you look at actors in a Hollywood movie, it's like a pyramid. The top of the pyramid, smallest number of actors. But they're at the top. Those are the lead actors. Below them, supporting actors. Below them, bit parts. And at the bottom, you got the walk-ons. The bit parts maybe have one line. The walk-ons are the people who are walking in the back of the street scene, sitting in the restaurant in the background, while the main actors, the stars, are having a conversation, talking to each other. There's no one in that story, in the set, who's not there for a reason. Okay, so too in human history, every human being serves a purpose. But in our case, unlike in Hollywood, by the way, if you become one of these A-list actors, like if you look at the highest earning actor for 2019 was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and the highest earning actress was Scarlett Johansson, who is Jewish. I always jokingly say, if I can just get her to come to a girls' seminary in Jerusalem, I could probably get about 50,000 guys to go to yeshiva. But these guys, they make a ton of money. Everyone loves them. The downside of being these guys is that you got no private life. Everything that happens is on the cover of People magazine, paparazzi, whatever. That's the Hollywood actors. But in our story, the real story, when we chose for ourselves with Abraham this unique plot, this unique role in the plot, we will not get the fame and the fortune, but we get all the paparazzi. And the analogy I'm giving you now is to clearly illustrate that just like in the Hollywood movie, the camera focuses obsessively on the stars, so too the lens of human interest will obsessively focus, often negatively, on the Jewish people. We don't get the fame and fortune, we just get the paparazzi, which explains something that happens to us, which is unique and even supernatural. But what happens when weird or supernatural happens to you every day? It just becomes natural and normal. The person who said this the best was the late, great newspaper columnist Charles Krauthammer. He said, "Jews is news." And we know good news is no news. Only bad news makes news. So when a Jew is perceived to do something wrong, even when he hasn't, or the Jewish state, think about it, little teeny bastion of liberal, Western, industrialized democracy, free market, open, multicultural, multi-religious state in the heart of the Middle East, which is the worst neighborhood in the world, where there's no democracy, no human rights, no women's rights, no industrialization, nothing, and some of the worst human rights violations in the world. Yet no one seems to care about any of that, but everyone obsesses on the Jewish people. I made a negative comment before about the UN being in the Tower of Babel today. Think about it, the UN every year, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, Security Council passes 26 or 27 condemnations a year. Every year, 21 of those 26 or 27 are against Israel. There have been war resolutions passed by the UN condemning Israel that every other country in the world combined in the last 40 years. It's insane. I could go on and on about the double standard. But we see it illustrates exactly the point. Just as in our movie, our little superhero, he doesn't even want the job, but he can't escape his destiny. He might be insignificant in terms of his size, but everyone is going to focus on him. He's going to be the target of so much obsessive focus. So too, we see that's the reality of the Jewish people. And and when you look at who we are, people don't appreciate this. Like when I fly in airplanes, which is way too often, although lately I haven't been flying anywhere because they're all shut down. I love asking people sitting next to me. It's not the first question I ask them, because then they would ask to change their seat. I say, "Excuse me." Once I get in a conversation with them, I ask them, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? The numbers they give me are unbelievable. Usually 100 to 1,000 times more than there really are. I've had at least 30 people tell me there's many Jews in the world as Chinese, and half of them were Chinese. I had one guy once tell me, speaking of the theme of our presentation now, he said, "Everyone in Hollywood is a Jew who got a nose job and changed his name." I said, "You're pretty anti-Semitic, but 50% correct." But anyway, that gets exactly to the point. Why do people think there's so many more Jews in the world than there really are? And by the way, the number of Jews in the world is all of 0.2% of the world's population. 0.2% of the world's population. When I tell it to people, they don't believe it. And this goes back to another point, that the hero has, we are, despite our teeny tiny size, just as in the Hollywood epics, the hero is never physically big. In the case of Frodo, he's a halfling. Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, they're often not even adults yet. They're young people, but they have incredible strength. And that's exactly the point, which is what makes them the hero. The characteristics that Abraham had have basically been passed on to the Jewish people throughout history. We have this idea in Judaism, which is of spiritual genetics. We all appreciate from biology physical genetics, that as parents, we pass on to our children DNA. I always love looking at the kids, multiple kids from the same parents, to see which model they are. The mommy model, the daddy model, the hybrid model. But Judaism says there's also spiritual DNA. It's not just for Jews, it's everyone. You pass on to your kids certain character traits. And while a lot of people have opted out of the Jewish people throughout history, we've remained teeny tiny in number, even though we should be a huge nation by now, given how long we've been around and how high our birth rate has traditionally been throughout history. And given that anyone can join the Jewish people, but the core of who we are goes back to Abraham and his personality. And we talked about that before, but it has enabled us to be, despite our teeny tiny size, just like Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Frodo, any of these people, Neo, far more impactful. And what's interesting, and therefore on some level, far more threatening to a big bad guy who shouldn't even paying any attention to us because we're seemingly so insignificant. And by the way, a lot of famous non-Jews have pointed this out. Here's a great quote from Mark Twain, the famous American author. His real name was Samuel Clemens, who wrote in the 19th century. He said, if statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of smoke lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He's as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. It's interesting. We've also had all kinds of, we've been ghettoized and economically and physically marginalized and taxed especially high. I always mention that in Frankfurt, the Judengasse and the ghetto in Frankfurt before Napoleon broke down the walls in the early 20th century, Jews had 36 additional taxes they had to pay. And besides being locked out of all the other businesses that regular Germans can get into, a tax to be born, a tax to die, a tax for circumcision, a tax for burial, a tax for weddings, a tax for kosher wine, a tax for kosher meat, a tax for not serving in the German army, which you couldn't serve in even if you wanted to serve in the army and not pay the tax. That's with our hands tied behind us. But because of the strengths we talk about that Abraham had, an incredible think outside the box, radically transformative thinking. Jews always look for the niches. The angle, bring Jews in, Jews come into America on boats, steerage passage, like my great-grandparents came in the beginning of the 20th century with the shirt on their back and a few dollars in their pockets at the bottom of the barrel, living in the Lower East Side. I'm sure like a similar situation happened in Australia, but within 2 generations of the highest income earning bracket and creating all kinds of new things, international banking, Hollywood, you name it. That is that radically, and so it's a combination of always thinking outside the box, that trait of Abraham, the incredible drive. These are the spiritual traits, the spiritual DNA that Jews have. Non-Jews can have it, but Jews have them disproportionately, which explains why, by the way, we Jews are 0.2% of the world's population, but have 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, which is 11,250% more than we should have. Or 24% of the Fields Medals in mathematics, or 25% of the Forbes list. And we talked about how also, but this is precisely, and we also mentioned that Abraham is proactive, he cares. And we see this in Jews throughout history. You can see these traits. This is the trait, the personality of our superhero. Because it's not enough to be just radical and driven, you gotta care. And it's the caring that makes the superhero proactive. Take any cause to make the world a better place that you could think of in human history. Any political ideology to try and fix the world, communism, socialism, feminism, black civil rights, anti-apartheid. There's probably a lot of South Africans, because a lot of Australians are South African Jews originally, I know. Like Helen Sussman, Joe Slovo. It's unbelievable. Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. If it isn't founded by a Jew, it's run by Jews, because nothing gets Jews more excited than trying to fix the world, which is, by the way, the last Pew Research study they did, when they said the word Jew to Jews, 52% of Jews said that the number one attribute of being Jewish is commitment to social justice. That, by the way, I could do a whole talk on. It's not the job of the Jewish people. It's definitely an aspect of our personality and our mission, but these are all the personality traits of Abraham. But the point we have to recognize is this also explains why he's chosen, why someone seemingly so small like Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Frodo, they all have strengths and personality traits that give them, as we say, the right stuff to make them, despite their teeny size physically, incredibly impactful, a catalyst for change. And it also explains on the deepest level why we are so threatening. I want to read you a couple of quotes. This is from John Adams, second president of the United States, one of the founding fathers. He says, in spite of Bolingbroke and Voltaire, I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And this is exactly the point I was talking about in my book, World Perfect. That Nobel Prizes and Fields Medals in mathematics and causes and political ideologies aside and save the whales and you name it, the great strength of the Jewish people, the one thing that we really are supposed to putting our energy in, and the greatest transformative power we have had is in shaping the collective spiritual and moral conscience of the human race through the idea of one God and one absolute morality. And that is an idea that has had far bigger impact than everything else the Jewish people have done. And that ultimately, by the way, gives us, because we're going to switch into now why we're so threatening, once we understand what our mission is, starting with Abraham, and our real power is, and the impact that history has proven that we have had on the world despite our teeny tiny size, then we understand why we have always been perceived to have been so threatening to so many people and so many superpowers throughout human history. Listen to the words of Paul Johnson, British historian. He says, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. He says, above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result of that was monotheism and the three great religions that profess it. And he goes on to end by saying, it is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. This is huge. This is such a big point. This is the ultimate strength of the Jewish people, our ultimate mission. So now we understand what our destiny is in this world, to connect humanity back to reality, to get humanity back on target to the highest level of pleasure, which is relationship with God. And because we have been so doggedly pursuing as our historical agenda this idea, we have run smack into the face of some of the greatest empires in human history. Which brings us to this whole notion of what is it about us that is so threatening to other people. And I want to read just a quick quote from Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin's book. And we're focusing on anti-Semitism, which, by the way, is not only something that is not going away, it's at the highest levels it's been since the Holocaust. And it's important. And I do on my website, kenspiro.com, I have a whole presentation called Why the Jews. By the way, you're welcome to go to my website and you can watch the entire World Perfect presentation. All my content is there for free. But if you watch that World Perfect presentation on my website, and then you watch Why the Jews, which is a much more extended version of what I'm doing now, a light's going to go off in your head. now I get it. Now I understand what we're really about, what our real power is, and now I understand why so many superpower empires and so many people and so much evil has been focused on seemingly a people who pose no threat. Not a big empire. I always say the only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood, and it hasn't been a source of Jewish values. But listen to Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin. They say hatred of Jews has been humanity's greatest hatred. While hatred of other groups has always existed, no hatred has been as universal, as deep, or as permanent. And like I said, universal, deep, and permanent goes back to the point that we are the collective protagonist of the story that goes throughout generations and generations for millennia, and therefore that same hatred will track generation after generation throughout Jewish history, but it all goes back to this same mission of Abraham. And a lot of famous people have noticed that anti-Semitism is pretty wild stuff. Let me quote you now a quote from Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, one of the few Russian authors who wasn't an anti-Semite. He says, "What is a Jew? This question is not all so odd as it seems. Let us see what kind of peculiar creatures, which all the rulers and all the nations have together and separately abused and molested, oppressed and persecuted, trampled and butchered, burned and hanged, and in spite of all this is still alive." Like, what is it we're doing? The question we have to ask ourselves, our little superhero's a nice guy. Luke Skywalker's nice. Frodo's a nice guy. Neo's a nice guy. Harry Potter's a really sweet little kid. What is the thing we're doing that is so threatening that so many people feel that they have to obliterate us off the face of the earth? Now, if you study the history of anti-Semitism, we're not going to go into this in detail because we don't have time. We have been accused of a lot of stuff throughout history. We've been accused of killing, deicide, killing God's son Jesus. We just had Easter Sunday yesterday. We poison wells. That's coming all up now. It's, by the way, exploding, the accusations on the web of coronavirus being a product of Jews. We're in league with the devil. We control the world's economy, seismic activity, solar flares. We trigger tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves. We release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism. We send vultures to spy on Turkey and Saudi Arabia. We release wild pigs into Palestinian territory to destroy their crops and terrorize the population. The IDF is now, of course, deliberately driving vehicles into Palestinian territory that are sprayed with coronavirus to poison the population. Last year, Iran accused Israel of stealing its cloud cover. Some of these things were said 1,000 years ago. Some of these things are said on the news today. These are all excuses. When we're dealing with why our big bad guys come after the Jewish people, we have to understand that it goes back to a much more fundamental ideological struggle that almost no one is focusing on, but it goes to the heart of what our whole story is about. Listen to what Mark Twain says again. He said, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they're gone. The Jews saw them all, beat them all. All things are mortal but the Jew. All their forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? And that's exactly the point. By the way, this point is so important. I made a t-shirt about it, and I do another. I'm showing my whole product line, all my books. Here's my t-shirt. You can actually see it here. It's when the souvenir stores are open in Israel, they're selling this baby. It says civilizations, nations, and empires that have tried to destroy the Jewish people and their status today. And it says ancient Egypt gone, Philistines gone, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine empires gone, 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 gone. Crusaders gone, Spanish Empire gone, Nazi Germany gone, Soviet Union gone. Iran with 3 question marks. Then it says at the bottom, the Jewish people, the smallest of nations, were the friend in the highest of places, so be nice. What do you think? 1 for every member of the General Assembly and 2 for the president of Iran? It's funny, by the way, most Jews are afraid to wear that shirt. Like, I can't wear it, don't kill me. I said, who? A Babylonian? He's gone. Just don't wear it in Iran. You know who buys and wears all these shirts? Evangelical Christians, mostly Americans. They're always going to my Instagram and Facebook page, Rabbi Spiro. I live in Yazoo, Mississippi, and I wear your t-shirt to my church because God loves the Jewish people. Because, by the way, and I do this presentation for a lot of evangelical audiences, they know their Bible well. They know the role the Jewish people are supposed to play in the story. And they see this all happening. But the real question is, guys, is what is it about us that is so threatening to the world? Look at all the Nobel Prizes we give, all the causes we found, how much charity we give that is so threatening. We have to get past the smoke screens of well poisoning and Christ killing and plagues and everything else we're accused of and focus on the real issue. And to do that, I want to just take you for a minute into the mind of the greatest modern anti-Semite, Adolf Hitler. And now when we read him, and he's a big bad guy, He's the ultimate bad. He's the Darth Vader of his era. We understand exactly what is so threatening about our little superhero. What does Hitler say? The struggle for world domination be fought entirely between us, between Germans and Jews. All else is facade and illusion. Even when we have driven the Jew out of Germany, he remains our world enemy. Now, Hitler doesn't view him as fighting militarily the Jews, but ideologically he does. He goes on to say, listen to this quote, the 10 Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish like circumcision. Whoa. That is the greatest backhanded compliment ever given to the Jewish people. By the way, the first people to go after circumcision in history was not Hitler. It was the Greeks in the Hanukkah story 2,500 years ago, 2,200 years ago, which was history's first ideological war when paganism was declaring war against the only monotheistic faith that existed in the world at the time. This is pre-Christianity. Hitler goes on to say, if only one country for whatever reason tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family would become the germ center, speaking of plagues, bacteria, he says, for fresh sedition. If one little Jewish boy survives without any Jewish education, with no synagogue and no Hebrew school, it's in his soul. Whoa. That's pretty unbelievable. That's incredible. So now we understand totally why we are so threatening. We talked about the spiritual DNA, why Jews have certain traits. Hitler recognized that even a Jew who is totally disconnected from Judaism, never went to Hebrew school or had a bar bat mitzvah, he still has this programming. And if left to his own, he will reproduce other Jews who will have the spiritual DNA to always try and fix the world and bring the Jewish-based values into the world. And therefore, every single Jew has to be eradicated. When we understand this, we understand why we have been so threatening, why the odds have been so stacked against us, why so many attempts have been made in human history to wipe what is seemingly a physically non-threatening people who seem to be really nice off the face of the earth. Over and over and over again, we see this has happened. I want to read you a quote from, one more quote from Ernst von den Haag, who wrote a great book called The Jewish Mystique. Because what he focuses on, this book came out in 1969, and what he's focusing on is the fact that a Jew is always a Jew. Even if I'll give a great example. Bernie Sanders is a classic example. He's a person who is not at all connected to Judaism, not even particularly supportive of Israel, but he has such a Jewish soul, albeit without the proper software. But listen to what he says. This is Ernst von den Haag, American-Dutch sociologist, 1969, in his book, The Jewish Mystique. The Jews have invented more ideas and made the world more intelligible for a longer span and for more people than any other group. They have done this indirectly, always unintentionally, and certainly not in concert, but nevertheless comprehensively. Jews continue to feel the yoke, the task, the moral mission of being Jews, of preserving themselves as such, and to the surprise, scorn, at times hatred of the rest of the world, of refusing to become anything else. The Jew may call himself a humanist or an atheist, a socialist or a communist. They may even dislike Jewishness and deny it in scientific terms, but rarely do they refuse to carry it. They won't give up being Jewish even when they're consciously tried to, when they change their names, intermarry, and do everything to deny their Jewishness. Yet they remain aware of it, and though repudiating it, they cling to it. They may repress it, but they do act it out symptomatically. Their awareness of their Judaism is shared by others simply because their denial is so ambivalent. Unconscious or not, at least some part of every Jew does not want to give up his Jewishness. And on a level which is often unconscious amongst the people who hate us, they recognize that every one of those Jews, even the non-connected ones, like our little superhero, represents a force, a mission, a power in the world that is so transformative that they must be stopped. So, and think about it, guys. It's been 3,377 years since Abraham first got his mission. We are now at the 3,332nd Passover. And the 32nd year since we got the Torah at Mount Sinai and Shavuos, which we're going to be celebrating in less than 50 days. We're counting towards that now. We have, as Mark Twain said, we saw them all, we beat them all. We have taken a very difficult journey that has spanned millennia. We have suffered the greatest, continuous, most irrational, violent hatred in human history, yet we have outlasted. Despite all the odds, just like in our movie, we have outlasted all the people who came against us, who now, as Mark Twain says, they sit in twilight now or have vanished. And we continue to have incredible strength, and despite our teeny size, to constantly impacting the world in so many ways. You can literally go through our little thing here. We can check off every single one of these and see that everything more or less described in our story beats of our Hollywood movie has actually come about. The one thing we're missing, by the way, and if we look, we've checked off down to here, is the notion of a final cataclysmic showdown, which, by the way, is a major theme in Jewish history, which is talked about in Ezekiel and Zechariah, which is the war of Gog and Magog. By the way, you don't have to panic. Even though everything was predicted has happened so far, negative prophecy in Jewish history, by the way, is always a warning that can be avoided if we do the right thing. But so far, every one of those major story beats and every one of those Hollywood epics fits exactly the reality of the plot of who we, the Jewish people, are in this ultimate narrative and this story. And the amazing thing is, there's an expression that says, they won the battles but lost the war. I always flip that over and I say, the reality of Jewish history is we lost most of the battles, but we won the war. We came up against great empires. Yes, we outlasted them. Yes, today they're all sitting in museums and history books and don't exist anymore for the most part. But we suffered tremendously at their hands. Okay, the Greeks, we fought to a standstill, but with the Romans, they destroyed our country, multiple revolts, killed a huge percentage of the Jews in the world. We lost our country, went into exile for thousands of years. We were hounded from one country to another for millennia, suffering all kinds of horrendous persecutions, culminating in the Holocaust. And even the modern state of Israel is the only state in the world whose very existence is still being threatened by other member states of the United Nations. That is demonized. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. The plot of this movie does not change. So we lost the battle, so to speak, but we won the war. When I say we won the war, we won the ideological war. Okay, we have transformed the world's values. The whole world looks basically at the world, at their values and religion through Jewish lenses today. The basic foundational concepts of Western liberal democracy, like it says in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Amongst these are the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That this comes from the very mission that the original superhero in our story, Abraham, brought into the world 3,700 years ago. And we Jews have always perceived this. And Jews who have stayed connected to Judaism have recognized this. Listen to Nikolai Berdyaev. I love this quote. Listen to he's a Soviet era, 1935. This is atheist communist era Soviet historical philosopher. This is my favorite quote of all. He says, he's talking about our history. He sees it. We don't. He says, the Jew's destiny is too imbued with the metaphysical to be explained either by material or positive historical terms. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon demonstrating the life of this people is governed by a special predetermination. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the fateful role played by them in history, all these point to the particular and mysterious foundations of their destiny. He objectively standing back, and communist Soviet Russia sees Jewish history, we are living supernatural phenomenon. Paul Johnson, however, he gets it because just as Abraham understood there's a God who controls history and we play a central role in the story, Paul Johnson sums this up beautifully. He says, if the earliest Jews were able to survey with us the history of their progeny, meaning us who came afterwards, they would find nothing surprising in it. They always knew that Jewish society was the pilot project for the entire human race, that Jewish dilemmas, dramas, and catastrophes should be exemplary, larger than life, would seem only natural to them, that Jews should over millennia attract such unparalleled, indeed inexplicable hatred would be regrettable, but only to be expected. Above all, that Jews should survive when all those other ancient people were transmuted or vanished into history was wholly predictable. How could it be otherwise? Providence decreed it. So we can see this is exactly the point. We are in a story. It's a plot. We can choose to ignore it, but you stick your head in the sand. The show goes on. It's like gravity. I believe it. You don't. We both jump off a building. You don't float and I fall because you don't believe in gravity. But the point of all of this is to recognize that every single one of these points is a reality. We are the protagonists in this ultimate story. Rather than freaking out about it, I do a class called The Edge of History. You could also watch it on my website. And it talks about the convergence, a biblical end of days story, with what's going on now. And by the way, the rabbis say that we have 6,000 years. A movie doesn't go on forever. Our epic stories may have extended versions, like you can watch 12 hours of Lord of the Rings, but it does end eventually. We got a deadline at 6,000 years. And if we know we are at 5,780, we got a maximum of 220 years left. That's a maximum. And we don't want to wait to the end. You don't want to wait to have to be medevaced out of here. We want to get to the end of the story quickly and painlessly. So I do this whole class explaining how we are literally a few headlines away from convergence of biblical end of days narrative. With the headlines we're reading in the news today, I'm not necessarily talking about the coronavirus here. I don't think Messiah is right around the corner personally, but then again, I don't know. I'm not a prophet. If I was, I'd be working in the stock exchange and not teaching. But I teach this class in America, and a guy raised his hand. He goes, "Rabbi, I believe you. I believe it's all true. I'm making an end of days bomb shelter in Montana." And I said, that's not why I'm doing this, guys. I didn't do the class to scare you out of your mind to think the world's at an end. Like I said, the bad stuff doesn't have to happen. We just have to embrace the fact that this is a reality. Yes, like in the movie, we do have the final showdown is yet to come, but it doesn't have to happen. We do know that one way or another, we'll get through this. But how quickly, how painfully, what condition we'll be in. Will there be 14 million Jews, 25 million Jews, or 1.4 million Jews? Will the world have to go through some cataclysmic event that makes the coronavirus look like a joke? Or can we slide in easily and comfortably? That is up to the human race in general, and it's up to the Jewish people specifically. If we are the character in the story, like we see, and our role is significant, we cannot opt out, especially not at this very difficult and dangerous time. We have to embrace. I always say, we should say, Ashreinu Matov Halkenu as Jews. Happy are we as good as our lot. Being Jewish might not be comfortable, but it's always meaningful. We should thank God that we were born as children of Abraham and Sarah into a unique responsibility. But to do this, and this is not fantasy, this is the reality of Jewish history. To do this, we have to be educated, because you can't represent the Jewish people until you know what the Jewish people represents. Ignorance is the greatest threat to us, not anti-Semitism. And Jews for Judaism, and Jews who are united, and Jews using the incredible energy and drive we have to push this agenda, this mission to its end, are the key to getting through this incredible story as quickly and as painlessly as possible. And I believe, by the way, if I might throw in something about current events of the coronavirus, I believe that one of the big lessons we are learning is the world is at war for one time with everyone on the same side fighting a microbe. And we are supposed to recognize that we have a lot in common. And when it comes down to it, viruses don't recognize differences between people. By the way, anti-Semites don't recognize differences between different kinds of Jews. They don't distinguish between Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionists, Conservatives, Liberals, Democrats, or Republicans. We Jewish people have to recognize that our primary focus needs to be first and foremost on Jewish unity and Jewish proactivity. We are the collective superhero in this story. We are very close to the end of the story, but now is the time we need to marshal our strengths and make the right decisions, having Jews for Judaism, focusing on this mission, giving the world the role model, which it's our destiny to be part of, and then we can get to the end of the story as quickly and as painlessly as possible. And I just wanted to end with one quote from Cecil Roth, and then I'll let you guys go. He's a famous Jewish historian, one of the few who is actually traditional. He died in the 60s, actually, I believe. But his quote reverberates through until today. And with this, I will leave you. He said, our survey of 3.5 millennia of Jewish history is closed. But the story, which is we have set ourselves to telling, is unending. Today, the Jewish people has in it all those elements of strength and endurance which enable it to surmount all the crises of its past, surviving thus the most powerful empires of antiquity. Throughout our history, there have been weaker elements who have shirked the sacrifices which Judaism entailed. They have been swallowed up long since in the great majority. Only the more stalwart, that's us guys, have carried on the traditions of our ancestors and can now look back with pride upon the superb heritage. Are we to be numbered with the weak majority or with the stalwart minority? It is for ourselves to decide. But from a reading of Jewish history, one factor emerges which may perhaps help us in our decision. The preservation of the Jew was certainly not casual. He has endured through the power of a certain ideal based upon the recognition of an influence of a higher power in human affairs. Time after time in his history, moreover, he has been saved from disaster in a manner which cannot be described excepting as, quote, providential, unquote. The author has deliberately attempted to write this book in a secular spirit. He does not think that his readers can fail to see in it on every page a higher eminence. Guys, we have to recognize we are close to the end of the story. We have a unique destiny to play. Now more than ever, the human race needs Jews for Judaism. And if we can just unite and have some powerful, proactive Jewish energy going in the right direction, then we get to the end of the story, which is the ultimate story, as quickly and as painlessly as possible. I want to thank you all for joining me. There's my website. You can see it's kenspiro.com. All my content is there online for free. You can listen, read, and watch. If anyone would like the sources that I read today, you can send me an email to Ken Spiro, as my name is spelled, at gmail.com, and I will send you a Word document with all of those sources. I'm also happy to answer any questions you have. It's been a pleasure. Everyone should have a happy and healthy Hag Sameach. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Spiro, thank you so much. Really appreciate giving your time, and it's been a wonderful presentation as always. Thank you so much. Everyone, I'm sure, is appreciative. I encourage everybody to go check out the website. We'll be shortly joined by Rabbi Goldman. So unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions, but please send your questions through to Rabbi Spiro. And thank you again. And please bear with us for the next few moments as we will hand over to Rabbi Goldman. Thank you very much.
Okay, there we go.